This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid state turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's at geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders. Today, I am honored to have Matthew Scullion. He is the founder and CEO of Matillion, and they are a provider of enterprise cloud data integrations. And we're going to talk today about, data in the cloud. Why is it important? We're going to talk about how low code has maybe affected our industry in the past several years. And we're also talking a little bit about the differences between ELT and ETL and whatever else comes up in this conversation. With all that being said, Matthew, welcome to the show.
John, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background, kind of how you got to where you are today, and what is it that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So personally, background, I've been in the IT industry about 25 years. I'm moderately embarrassed to admit. Spending most of that time working around software development, both for corporate end users, as well as for the last 12 or 13 years running an ISV, a software company. And I've also spent a chunk of that time working around data and making data useful for organizations. Perhaps more importantly, the company I represent, Matillion, we are the data productivity cloud. So we provide a platform that allows organizations to make their data business ready faster. And we do that by providing a range of services that allow them to do that.
Awesome. So when it comes to data services, and I can go back, I remember 10 years ago, I was working for an ISP and we wanted to establish our first data warehouse and kind of build it out and eventually move that into a data lake and kind of capture data from our customers and things like that. And it was one of those things where it was all buzzwords, we need this data. And then if you ask anybody in the business side, what are we going to do with it? They didn't know. And now we see the importance of data, protecting it, securing it, and then using it for all sorts of correlations with information and figuring out how to best serve our customers. How have you seen this kind of growth over capture the data, and now what do we do with it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think growth is a word I'd latch on to there, John. I often think in IT, we've been doing the things that we do today for decades. Mm-hmm. Like the fundamental computer science often doesn't change that much, but other things do change that change the applicability and scale of them. So we were doing data warehousing in the 80s and 90s, and therefore doing ETL and things like that to make the data useful for downstream analytics workloads. The thing that's changed today is the cloud, really, because the cloud's made something that used to be really expensive and difficult, data warehousing, much easier and more cost effective to be done. And therefore, everyone can do it. Every company, every department, to some extent, every person within a company. And that creates a competitive imperative, right? Like if you're not doing it, you're then losing out to your competition. So I think what's happening today is every aspect of how we work, live, and play is being changed. We hope for the better with data, and that's why we all need to become data analytics, data warehousing, data science experts as organizations.
Yeah. So how is it that, let's say I'm a software developer for a small to medium-sized company, and we developed some type of strategy with media. We put it out there. We start collecting. We start getting customers, start getting views, start getting revenue coming in. We've got advertisers now. What do we do from here? Like, how do we get to the next step of actually getting our data in the cloud, making it useful, which is probably the biggest part, because a lot of people put data in different places, but they don't know how to use it. At least that's what I've seen. I've seen a lot of companies. I've worked for several of them where we capture data, we put it out, we don't know what to do with it, and we just let it sit there. So how is it we get to that next step of making it useful?
Yeah, and you're so right. It's if you don't mind me saying, John, nice to hear you recognizing that challenge of making it useful. We can maybe talk more about what percentage of the challenge that is later on in the conversation, because I think it's a really big part of the challenge. But yeah, I mean, to use an analogy, if I may, data for me is a bit like iron ore, right? So if we just talk about iron and steel for a minute, the world's made of iron. And therefore there is no shortage of iron. But it starts off its life valuable, but not useful, right? It's in a state that isn't useful. To make it useful, you've got to dig it out of the ground, take it to an iron refinery, turn it into iron, blast it with some carbon, turn it into steel. And then you can make interesting things out of it, like cars and ships and bridges and buildings. Data's the same, particularly today. We're inundated with the stuff. Every new system that we buy creates data. We did a survey not too long ago of about 200 of our large enterprise customers. The average number of systems that they had data in that they wanted to get that data out of and put to work in analytics or data science was just over 1,000 systems each. Not 1,000 data points, 1,000 systems. Like one system like SAP can have 80,000 data points in it, and they've got 1,000 systems. So the challenge is just the same as with iron ore, right? You've got to dig it out the ground and refine it into something useful before you can make interesting stuff out of it. And in the case of data, the digging it out the ground is the getting it out of systems. And the refining it into something useful is joining it together, making sure it's accurate, making sure the right people get the right data, denormalizing it and aggregating it so it kind of all makes sense with each other, embellishing it with metrics, which, you might have got column 1 and column 2, but you need to add them together and divide them by 3 to get column 3, if that makes sense. And then once you've done all that, you've then got your valuable raw material, your steel, which you can then use in your data science project or your analytics project. Dig it out of the ground, extract, put it somewhere central, load, turn it into something useful, transform. And that's where ETL or ELT come from.
So tell me the difference between ETL and ELT, because we extracting, loading, transforming, or do you do it in different order? Like, what's the difference and why does that matter? Okay,
yeah, great question. So maybe the easiest way to answer this is to go back in time a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, data warehousing has been around a long time, longer than I suspect either of us, John. And therefore, the challenge of turning the iron ore into steel, getting the data out of systems and making it useful inside the data warehouse has been around a long time as well. So to do that, you need to get it out of the ground, extract, you need to get it into the data warehouse, load, and you need to get it into the right shape and size to make it useful for analytics and data science. That's transform. So back in the day, data warehouses were really expensive, right? They were, a piece of metal, an appliance, and they cost $1 million, $5 million, $10 million bucks. So you really wanted to optimize their use for serving the data warehouse users, right? And you'd buy just the right size one for doing that. And someone would put their arms around it and say, please don't touch this. It was really expensive. So the ETL bit, the bit where you were kind of getting the data ready to put in it, that happened off the data warehouse. It happened on separate infrastructure, a separate set of servers. And so the order you did it in was you got the data out of the source system, extract, you did the transformation on this separate infrastructure, transform. And then once you had the stainless steel, right, once you had the finished analytics ready data, you just load that result set into the data warehouse. And that expensive piece of equipment could then just take care of serving that data out to users. Now you fast forward to the cloud world, And what you want to do is the exact same thing. You want to make data business ready. You want to turn iron ore into steel. But data warehouses have gotten really cheap and powerful and easy to scale up, right? You can go onto Snowflake's website or AWS and spin up Redshift, or Google Cloud and spin up BigQuery, et al. And you can spin up a incredibly powerful data platform, and you only pay for what you use, and it's all quite cost effective. So what it now makes sense to do, instead of doing the processing to transform data off the data warehouse, it makes sense to load the raw materials onto the data warehouse and then get the data warehouse to do the transformation in terms of the compute. So ELT, we simply switch around the order. We extract just the same as we used to, but before we've transformed it, we load it onto the data warehouse, and then we push down the transformations onto the data warehouse because it's the fastest, most cost-effective place to do it. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, it does. So now it's cheaper to kind of push it up and then transform it there versus doing it. And plus, I guess we also have more data sources now than we probably did before too, that we were pulling all that from, and we need to aggregate them in some way.
We definitely do. I don't think that's what drives ELT though. So I mean, let me be like one notch more technical. If I go too technical, like hold me up. But let's say you've got a table of customers on Salesforce and a table of transactions on a MySQL database on a website. In ETL world, pre-cloud, you'd have run some ETL software and it'd have had a MySQL connector and a Salesforce connector. And it would have sucked the data out of those two systems, and it would put it in an intermediary state somewhere on its own infrastructure. And you'd have a set of servers running the ETL software. And then code would run, probably Java code, or at least the one I used to use was Java. And it would say, okay, I'm going to go through row by row. Customer Matthew Scullion, this is his transactions, and match them up. And it'd make one flat row that says Matthew has bought 3 things off the website. And that's the transformation piece. It's taking the raw data from Salesforce, the raw data from MySQL, and it's creating me one output line that says Matthew's bought 3 things. And then we'd load that line, just the line that says Matthew's bought 3 things, into the expensive data warehouse. Now what we do, and it's the same business problem we're solving, it's just the underlying technical architecture that's changed. We still have a connector for Salesforce and for MySQL. We still suck the data out of those 2 systems. But rather than join the data together on the ETL software infrastructure, we just load it straight into the data warehouse. So straight into Databricks Delta or Snowflake or Redshift or BigQuery or one of those.
Yeah.
And then we run a line of SQL to say, please join Matthew's Salesforce record to Matthew's transaction record to create a new row that says Matthew bought 3 things. And modern cloud data platforms are capable of resolving that SQL very quickly and very cost effectively, even in billion and trillion row use cases. So it's just cheaper and faster to actually do that transformation piece on the data warehouse than it is to do it on some separate infrastructure as it used to be. Now, you can, therefore, as you may well have concluded from that oversimplified example, John, you can do ETL almost by hand, right? You can write code to do it. The challenge then becomes, is of course, it's rarely just 2 systems and 1 line that you want to produce. It's many systems, thousands of data objects, and thousands or tens of thousands of data elements that you want to create. And that's where you then need software to make you productive doing it, which is what we do.
So wouldn't ELT also keep the data kind of in a more raw form, so that if you decided that we need to transform it in a different way or link things up in a different way, we have the ability now because we haven't modified it or massaged it before loading it?
Yeah. And different customers take a view on that different ways. So you could keep all the raw data. You could load the raw data, process it into the analytics business ready data, and then throw the raw data away. It'll always be in the source systems that you got it from, remember, so you can always go back and get it again. But yeah, that's an option, definitely.
So where do you see this all going? So, like, obviously cloud is kind of where everything needs to be for lots of different reasons, whether it be from business continuity, ease of access, cost, which is probably the biggest driver that I see from an IT leadership perspective, security. There's lots of reasons, but are we gonna get to the point where we're oversaturating or we're spending too much, where we're storing too much? And how do we know when we've got maybe too much data, or is that even a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You're not asking an entirely unbiased person here, right? In that way, you're not going to get a CEO of a data productivity
Right.
company saying there's too much data. I don't
Well, I
suppose.
see from my perspective is we always want to keep loading and keep putting new data in there, but sometimes we get to a point where the old data isn't as valuable as the expense to keep it.
I mean, so a couple of points on that. On the keeping it point, I mean, modern cloud data platforms, it's so incredibly cheap to keep data, then you really need to be keeping genuinely vast volumes of it before.
Okay, let me rephrase that, because it's not from a cloud hosting perspective, but maybe from a let's think about GDPR and maybe some of the other regulations where I have to delete someone's data from a certain point. If it's really old, then it's going to cost me more effort to go in and make sure that record is cleared out. Whereas if I have a data retention plan that says every 24 months I'm going to purge data, then it makes it a lot easier to be in compliance with California privacy and GDPR and things like that.
And John, I think you land on one of the key areas here, which is around governance and compliance, yes. Right? So certainly it's the case that as we find more ways to create and put data to work, and that becomes more sophisticated over time in our organizations, and B, as governments and nations legislate around the safe and healthy use of data, then that need for compliance, governance, privacy, and security certainly becomes top of mind with the chief data officer or the individual practitioner, in fact, across the organization. For me, though, the real choke point is different. The real choke point's a human one, because why are we all doing all this stuff with data? Well, it's a competitive imperative, right? Yep. Like, if you can, someone will. If that someone is your competition and they do it and you don't, then they've got a competitive advantage over you. So maybe it's to serve your customers better, or develop better products, or streamline business processes, or eke out some other way of serving your customer base better than your competition does. Then you kind of got to put this stuff to work. And it's people that are the constraint on that. Just by way of a short example, if we do it in a highly technical way, then only highly technical people can do it. And most organizations don't have enough highly technical people. So in the worldwide race for innovating with data productivity is what will then start to hold you up. So that's the thing I see happening with data the most. Like, how can we put all this stuff to work, and how can we make people as productive as possible? Does that make sense?
It does. And we've seen that shift going in from everything having to be like you have to be a software developer to write apps, to build things. And now we get into like low code development, where things can be, more distributed along the organization. And, we've utilized that where I'm at quite significantly, where we try to get other people to use tools, whether it be simple things like Power Automate in Office 365 to build little flows and things like that, to automate their own data and their own process, so that they can spread things out. We don't have to send everything through the software development team to build it, and maintain those apps going forward. Just say decentralize that, let each individual process doing that. Have you seen an uptick in the use of low code when it comes to and data in general?
100%. I mean, that's kind of the key thesis behind Matillion, really, and our data productivity cloud. So we have kind of three strap lines that describe our platform, and that it's that Matillion is stack ready, and that means it's built for the cloud and all the different components that you need to be thinking about when you're building data analytics solutions. Your legacy data stores, your modern SaaS applications, but also your cloud cloud hyperscaler like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud and your cloud data platform like Snowflake or Databricks. That's stack ready. We talk about future ready, and that's talking about the fact you really want this stuff to be super easy to stand up and learn, and you want to be able to get productive in a few minutes and get your first deliverable in a few hours or days. But you need to be able to scale it to the biggest organizations. But the bit that we're talking about, John, is everybody ready. And for me, this is key. And I think we see it in all technology revolutions. At the beginning, stuff is the purview of engineers and enthusiasts. And so the world doesn't change that fast because only a small number of people can do it. And then over time, you use software to make it easier and more people can get involved. And therefore, the rate of innovation comes up. And that's where low code, no code comes in. Maybe in an organization, you've got a data engineer writing quite low level SQL or DBT or Python to take data from its raw state into a business ready state. That's great. They can go yay fast and there's only so many of them. Right. But if you can make it more accessible to do that, well, perhaps you can get a data scientist to do that, or a tech savvy marketer, or a business intelligence developer. And that means you can get more people into the pass rush. So you go faster that way. Secondly, it means each of them can go faster because the software is doing some of the work. But thirdly, those people are closer to the business problem. So there's less friction. And so those are some of the advantages we think of low code. The reason we say everyone ready, by the way, is because there will always be a need for engineers. And so you need, in our opinion at least, you need somewhere where engineers can work and where people can work in a low code, no code environment. And that way you've kind of got the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And also, I mean, when I look at data, being someone who's been on both the software development side, doing customer facing applications and web applications and things like that, but also on the infrastructure side, there's, I see it as two different classes of data. We have data that is going to be used by marketers or sales teams and things like that, that is customer data. And then we also have backend infrastructure data that we also need to see. Like if we're building tools that no one's using, we need that analytics as well. So we know that we don't need to maintain this piece. We need to get this out. This is, we're creating tech debt that's not necessary. So we need to be able to see data that's only for the engineering side that doesn't need to, filter up to the marketing group. So we have two different classes of data that we're looking at. And so I definitely see that there's a need for engineering pieces as well. And also we look at infrastructure and cybersecurity. We want to keep logs of things. We want to keep records of information that aren't necessary for, like, we don't need to show the marketing group when someone changed their password, but we need to keep that information in case we have a security event that it becomes important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's those kind of nowadays, those crossover use cases between those two that you mentioned. So you've got your I don't know, like log-based data that you're looking at to help you run IT infrastructure. And then you've got corporate data like sales and marketing and financial. There's stuff that kind of sits in the middle of that as well. Like one example, a customer of ours is a large retail bank that you'd have heard of. The data flowing through Matillion's platform there is cybersecurity data, right? Anti-fraud data, basically. So if certain patterns of transaction are happening over here on the left, and then someone applies for a credit card on the right, you need to be able to approve or decline that credit card transaction. So on a use case by use case level, depending on what the use case is, but also just depending on who the person is, right? I mean, it might be that this person's lucky and they're a data engineer and that's their skill set. They want to write code. That's fine. I mean, turkeys don't like Christmas and coders do like coding. And what you want to provide for them is a kind of DevOps and data ops familiar environment, and they can use Git and they've got proper separation of concerns between the components and they can use the language that they want. But you also want to provide a kind of accelerated and more accessible interface to making data business ready that can be used by either those engineers that fancy doing some stuff low code, no code for a particular use case and they want to go quick, or by a wider audience that doesn't know how to or that doesn't want to code. Now, the other thing about low code, no code that we hear a lot back from our customers is understandability and maintainability.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, if you draw data pipelines and you can see a picture, okay, this is where it loads from, this is how it joins to this other stuff, this is where the calculation is, then it's a lot easier to go back to that a month, a year, a couple of years later and figure out what was happening. And that makes maintaining it easier. And it also makes it easier to ramp new skills onto projects. So those are some of the things people think about.
Yeah, I think when it comes into maintainability, we also, from a company that has a kind of small development team, things get put in the pipeline, but we've got other projects coming up. And sometimes it just creates more technical debt if it has to go through a software developer versus low code when, our analytics, one of our analytics guys can just jump in and take care of it. Oh man, it saves us so much effort.
It's so right. And yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, we chat to customers about this stuff all the time. It's our business. And, we hear really impressive results. So I was chatting to a very large pharmaceutical company the other day. That's one of our larger customers. You would totally have heard of these guys. They're a gigantic company. And that they had 4 or 5 business lines that were using our software. And a couple of them, it was 70 to 80% more productive. So, okay, how long does it take us to solve a business problem, to make some data business ready? 70 to 80%. Now, to be fair, the worst performing one of the 5 was down at about 30%. So still good. And I think that shows that there's a range of applicabilities depending on the use case there, but that's a lot quicker. And the other thing is that they talked about simplicity, right? So, okay, using a platform to do it rather than hand coding it ourselves, then we could get away with having 10 jobs rather than 1,000. And again, those are representative from a real life customer story because we can build reusability. Ultimately, this stuff comes down to data productivity. And I said maybe we'd get a chance to come back to it earlier on in our chat, John. But what people forget is that, if you're looking out on the ocean of innovating with data, there's this little cool bit sticking above in the iceberg metaphor, which is the data science project or the dashboard or the kind of cool bit that business users want to see. But 70, maybe 80% of the work of making that little bit of ice stick out the top of the water, of making that data science project sing or that dashboard work, is in making the data business ready first. The extracting it, the joining it together, making sure it's right. If you're doing that 70% or 30% slower, if you're doing 100 times more complexity than you need to, then you don't get as many of those dashboards or data science projects. And that for us is why data productivity is so key.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it takes me back to my first job in data. I was my title was, I think, database administrator, and it was for a school. And it was a higher ed school, and we had and I was over the writing queries for our development team, which is the team that goes out and tries to get donations from wealthy alumni and things like that. And I remember we would go through so much effort to figure out, like, our college president was going to be in, let's say, Chicago on this date. What are the alumni that live in that area that make over a certain amount of money, that have donated in the past, but haven't donated in the last 365 days, that would be willing to go to dinner with our president? And how can we correlate that and figure out how to craft a nice invite that's personal for each one of those people?
So that is super weird because worldwide, and Matillion has, in the thousands range of customers nowadays, and many of those are small and mid-sized businesses, but actually the majority are very large enterprises around the world. The very first one, Patient Zero, a Matillion ETL customer back in 2015, was a university using the data, among other things, to help out with funding and donations. So,
yep.
And as a kind of similar one, a set of customers that we have a lot of nowadays are sports franchises, actually, for fans and audience segmentation. So, the Giants, the Red Sox. A bunch of MLB and football and other sport franchises, Aussie Rules football, A bunch of them all use our software for that very similar use case. So I empathize, John.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I remember like putting that together was such hard work. But nowadays, when I look at some of the tools that are out there, it's like, oh man, this is so easy now. I can just drag
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Definitely.
Lot's changed in 25 years.
Yeah, and that's back to where we were a few minutes ago, right? The computer science hasn't changed.
Correct.
It's still data. You still need to get it into the same place. But because it's easy, we all need to do more of it. And when you do more of it, having people that, I mean, you were a DBA, you were pretty technical, right? You could do it yourself. But now that everyone can do that, and every team and department within large organizations or every company is trying to improve every aspect of how we work, live, and play with data. And every time they do that, there's a little cool bit that they all talk about that sticks out the top of the water, which is the data science use case or the machine learning algorithm or the dashboard with the cool graphs and charts. Below the water, there's like 70 to 80% of the work in making the data business ready. Gosh, we've got to figure out a way of getting more productive at making data business ready.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're definitely heading in that direction, which has been awesome to see. And from a more technology leadership standpoint, it's really great to see that we can spread this out throughout the enterprise. We don't have to keep it all in tech. We don't have to have every request coming through us. It's something we can push out there and just kind of monitor from a high level from a security governance perspective and let the business kind of run with it, which is awesome because it makes them more productive. They get to market quicker with their information and we're no longer the bottleneck.
Yeah, John, I mean, nailed it. That's exactly what we see happening. I think don't get me wrong, there's a bunch of individuals and teams trying to sort out a given business problem, and because a lot of this software nowadays is self-serve and in the cloud, they can just spin up an infrastructure that 20 years ago would have cost you 10 million bucks.
Yeah.
And take you 9 months to buy, and they can have that stood up in a few minutes. But increasingly, particularly perhaps in the slightly larger organizations, the role that we see IT playing is almost as the kind of toolkit assembler. So they'll be like, okay, so when you're doing this, you put your data in Snowflake. And if you're going to put it in there, you kind of name it like this and you lay it out like this. And then if you want to load data in there, you use this. And if you want to transform that data, you do it in this way. And here's the tools that we've procured for you to do that. But then, and I don't like this phrase too much because it's been used a lot in our industry, but then that work is democratized out to the business. And that's kind of what we need to see happening, because otherwise it's going to be, 1 or 5 or 10 or 50 people at the center of an organization that are the choke point for making that data business ready. And if that's 80% of the work, they're the choke point for all those use cases that the business wants to do to change every aspect of how we work, live, and play.
Yep, absolutely. And I go back to, what we talked about at the very beginning when we set up our first data warehouse. Now that I think about timeline, it's more than 15 years. I said 10 or so, but it's been a lot more than 15.
Let's not talk about that, mate.
Yeah. when you set up something like that, it wasn't just that you had, the couple of people in the data warehouse team that would set that up and would run the queries for you or write the custom reports and things like that. It was also the infrastructure behind it. Before we had cloud, we had to, when we set it up, we had to purchase a SAN. We had to have someone that knew how to set up a SAN, and you had to back it up properly and how to manage the hardware and the infrastructure that went with it. And, nowadays it's just spinning up in the cloud, the infrastructure is taken care of, and we just have to make sure we run it from there. So cost is way down.
When Matillion was a little younger, this will have been around 2016, 17, we used to go along to the big industry conferences, as we still do. We have a bigger, posher booth now, John. But and in the early days, we were thinking, how can we stand out here? How can we explain about this concept of data productivity? And we came up with this stunt, in essence, John, called the Billion Row Challenge. And it wasn't about moving 1 billion rows around. That's not very impressive anymore. You should be able to move 1 billion rows around in a couple of minutes. But what it was, we started with nothing but a laptop and a credit card. And in 15 minutes, we'd set up, I think we used an AWS account. We stood up a data warehouse. We stood up Matillion as the data productivity layer. We stood up a data visualization tool. I think we were using Amazon QuickSight at the time, but it could have been any of them. We did all of that. And then using Matillion, we went off and we got 2 or 3 data sources. We actually centered the example around a New York taxi data set that you can get off the internet. And we have this thing called the universal connector. So you can load it like any REST API, you can kind of load automatically. So we went and pulled that in. And then we got some weather data from somewhere else and some other data from somewhere else. And we combined it into some business ready analytical data, which we then visualized in QuickSight. And by the end of the 15 minutes, that whole flow worked. So you've gone from having nothing at all to having a data warehouse, an integration layer, a visualization layer, pipelines built and scheduled, and you could visualize the data. And that's really the key thing about data productivity. It's being able to get to value quickly, which the cloud unlocks, but just having the cloud doesn't make it a slam dunk, right? You could still like get constrained around needing to hand code all of this stuff with a small number of skilled people who are finite in the organization.
Yeah,
we should
absolutely.
bring it back. It was a good stunt.
It was. It sounds like it. It reminds me of some of taking data and putting it together. The first time I think I remember really seeing the true value of that was we were back at that university doing donor things, and we were using a data set that I got from ArcGIS back in the day, which was a mapping data, and being able to overlay that and say, well, the president's going here, but they'll also be here. What's in between? And instead of just running the queries for this location, what do we have in between, and how can we get there quickly, and what kind of value is in there, so that not just at this location and this location, but in the dead time, can we find an event? Can we have a one-on-one thing with some donor or something like that? And being able to kind of overlay data from different sources was really like that was kind of eye-opening to me for the first time. And it's like now that seems to be commonplace.
Yeah, and I think because the cloud basically is the cloud, and companies that have been built on top of the cloud, that have built cloud native data platforms, like again, I mentioned the Snowflakes and Databricks of this world, they've kind of given that capability to all of us, and those opportunities to make things better, like for our company, for our customers, for the world at large. We have customers using our software to help discover drugs more quickly. We've got a particular organization using our software around distributing water in East Africa to improve irrigation. We have a bunch in energy optimization and renewables and things like that. So it could be to make the world better. 20 years ago, like the cost and friction of using data to make those business processes or things work better was like just too high. You're like, oh, well, I probably could make this better, but it's going to be $10 million in 2 years, and I need a team of dedicated people to do it. Whereas now everyone can. And yeah, you can look for those gaps in the middle of your ArcGIS data, as you were describing. The challenges it moves on to is, okay, we can all do it now. But suddenly we've got to be really productive. We've got the kind of raw materials. Reminds me, since we're talking about many years ago in our career paths, John, I don't know if you remember that I might be showing my age here, but Microsoft launched Microsoft Publisher, maybe in the 90s or something like that.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone in the world could create the front page of a magazine.
Yep, everybody had newsletters then, printable newsletters.
Yeah, but they couldn't, right? Because what they had was like really ugly newsletters, because they weren't graphics designers. So like the sort of media had been created for lots more people to do something that used to be privileged to a small number. But we couldn't make those people super productive doing it. And it's a little bit like that with data. The active site's been created with the cloud. Now the choke point becomes the people. And that's why data productivity for us is such an interesting and exciting issue to trying to be solving.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matthew, I really enjoyed this conversation. I love the trip down memory lane as well, and learning a lot about the things that you guys are doing. How can people connect with you online and find out more about what Matillion's working on, and how to learn more and maybe connect with you guys?
Oh, John, yeah, definitely. So you can go ahead and visit us at matillion.com. So just in case anyone can't understand my Manchester pronunciation, it's MATILLION.com, where you can find out all about the Data Productivity Cloud, but you can also self-serve and spin up a free trial and move some data around and make it business ready. If you want to talk to me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn, Matthew Scullion, or on Twitter at Matthew Scullion. Always happy to talk about data productivity or anything else from the annals of IT time, John.
Awesome. And I'll link that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com so people can click on it from there as well. And again, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. I feel like I learned a lot.
Thanks for having us. It's been fun.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.